Welcome to Engender Love. I'm your host, Dr. Shannon. Join me as we discuss all things gender so you can better connect with those around you. So let's get started as we engender love. For anyone who has never thought about what it means to be a woman before last week, that all changed with the controversy on the woman who was boxing for Algeria in the Olympics, Imane Khelif. All the discussions force people to consider the question, what makes a person a woman? If you do not know what I'm talking about, let me sum it up. After Italian boxer Angela Carini forfeited her boxing match in the Olympics with Khelif and would not shake her hand, social media blew up questioning whether or not Khelif is a woman, which she is. I'm not focusing on Khelif because she has had enough. In today's episode, though, I'm going to reflect on the discussions that came up from that controversy, like those of J.K. Rowling, and what their comments indicate about people's beliefs about what makes a woman, why many of the things discussed are actually incorrect, and the danger to everybody in using these definitions. So as you're considering your own beliefs about what makes someone a woman, let me share with you who this episode is for. This episode is for you if you're interested in a nuanced conversation about gender and enjoy being curious. This episode is for you if you believe in equal rights for women and want to understand how these discussions on gender endanger those rights. Feminists, I'm talking to you. This episode is for you if you're a healthcare provider who feels uncertain how to answer this question because you do not feel well informed on gender in the most up-to-date and accurate way. If one of these things describes you, this episode is dedicated to you. So let's dive into the different definitions that have come up across social media through the multiple conversations and multiple medias about being a woman. And these are some of the definitions I've come across. A woman is based on what they're assigned at birth. A woman is based on their chromosomes. A woman is based on hormone levels. A woman is based upon her appearance, especially her physique. A woman is based on having breasts. A woman is based on having a period. A woman is based on the ability to have a baby. These are just some, but probably the most common ones I've heard, not just in the last week, but personally with what I do as a gender educator, I hear these definitions a lot. When we look at J.K. Rowling's comments, J.K. Rowling just called Khelif a man. And it's really unclear why. Is it the reason of physique? There was also some discussion of Khelif and Lin Yutin being disqualified in the previous year by the International Boxing Association, which Khelif has said that was a conspiracy. And there are a lot of things floating around. But what I do know is that the president of the International Boxing Association at the time, who was the one that my understanding, could be incorrect, my understanding unilaterally made the decision to disqualify, the president was Imane Khelif of Russia. And what they said was that Khelif had failed an unspecified eligibility test. The other fact of the matter is the decision came right after she had beaten a Russian boxer who had previously been undefeated. It was after that fight that it came out that she was ineligible and removed. Now, she has met every eligibility criteria of the Olympics. However, there's so much speculation that goes into some of these assumptions of what makes a woman, like there's been discussions, are her chromosomes XY? I believe it's been established she was assigned female birth, but I think I've heard people question that. So it goes into that's what makes a woman. I've heard discussions of hormones saying that's what makes a woman. I don't know anything about Khelif, and like I said, she's been through enough. I just bring this up as we look at this list and discuss it further. So I'm going to touch on some of these. However, in my School for Engendering Inclusivity, we are able to dive deeper into each of these topics and answer every member's personal questions to really help educate with clarity. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to just touch on some of these. So the first one, that a woman is based on what they are assigned at birth. Now, assigning gender based on birth can be problematic because it makes multiple assumptions. One assumption it makes is that anatomy will appear one of two ways: in a way that would be classified as male or in a way that would be classified as female, when in actuality, we know that there are multiple ways that anatomy will develop, in which case we do not always assign based on anatomy. I've talked about this in a previous episode, but there are things called ambiguous genitalia where it's not clearly classified as one or the other. So if we assign gender based on anatomy, then that calls to question, would the babies with ambiguous genitalia be assigned non-binary? I mean, we know that they're not. And I'm just saying that to say, if you think it's based on anatomy, then what happens when the anatomy isn't clearly one or the other? Now, what happens currently in reality, although somewhat debated, is that there is often a committee of individuals that come together, and those committees and the decisions they have made throughout history is an episode in its own. Some of it is problematic, but there has definitely been a movement by the healthcare to include ethics, to continue to evolve in a way that is best and respectful for everyone. And I'll just say there's room for improvement, but we're moving there. Anyway, that aside, that's one of the problems of saying what you're assigned at birth with that assumption that anatomy is going to be one of two ways. The other problem is it also assumes that sex, the biological characteristics, and in this case, we're typically just looking at external anatomy, and gender, which is an inner sense of self, that they're the same things. But we know they're not the same things. If you have not heard my second podcast episode where I go into this distinction in more detail, it's worth a listen, because this is the most challenging part for people, and it makes sense why. I would venture to guess that all of us were raised to think that was one and the same thing, that whatever anatomy you had was going to be consistent with your inner sense of self, and we didn't think of those as two distinct things. But they are, and we know as our scientific knowledge has grown, as we begin to listen to people and their lived experience, as our understanding has developed, we know that those are two distinct things. They are not one and the same. And yet when we conflate it, it makes sense that if you think they're the same thing, then what somebody assigned at birth, meaning looking at their anatomy, is who they are. It makes sense that you might think that. But once you recognize that those are two separate things, you recognize that one can be associated with the other, but it does not necessarily mean that it causes the other. So that's some of the problem with that thinking. We can think of lots of examples where anatomy is not going to equal gender. Then the second one that I want to dive into is about chromosomes. Chromosomes basically have the same issue. The first one is that the assumption that chromosomes present in a binary, that they're either XX or XY, when the truth of the matter is there are many other options. There's XO, known as Turner syndrome. There's XXY, known as Klinefelter syndrome. There's XYY. There is mosaicism, which means that some cells may have a certain code and other ones will have different codes, and it goes on and on and on. Needless to say, it's not in a binary. That is what is partially problematic with chromosomes, is that there is not a binary. And there are plenty of examples where an XY chromosome may have a different physical appearance. So just like with assignment at birth, chromosomes are not binary, and chromosomes are a part of the biological characteristics that we refer to as sex, which, as I just mentioned, is different than gender. So those two things remain equally problematic, as well as we assume that certain chromosomes will lead to specific physical traits. However, that also is not true. If you want to look it up, look up Swyer syndrome, SWYER, or complete androgen insensitivity, and you'll find those are just two examples of where this is not true, that certain chromosomes do not necessarily equate to certain physical characteristics. And again, I can get into greater detail this, which I do for my members in the School for Engendering Inclusivity, but for the brevity of this episode, I'm just going to leave it at that and allow you to look that up. So physical traits, like the other kind of things mentioned, physical traits like having a period or the ability to have a baby, exclude many women, including cisgender women who don't menstruate or can't have children, and yet they are no less of a woman than anyone else. That's some of the problems with a lot of those definitions, is that it doesn't pertain to everyone. I think the only one I didn't really touch upon are breasts. And what I often think about, I remember having a friend, and I have a lot of these conversations with what I do. And I said, "What makes a woman to you?" And she said, "Breasts. Breasts make a woman to me. It's what distinguishes us, et cetera, et cetera." And I said, "I know that you have friends that have had double mastectomies. Are they any less of a woman because they had them removed?" And she stopped and said, "No, of course not. I never thought about that." And that's where our conversation landed. Now, I know some of you will say, "Yeah, but many people get reconstruction." And that's right. The reconstruction is gender affirming because that is how they see themselves, is to have breasts. And so they will have that, and that makes sense. And like everything I always say, there are always exceptions. And this is one of them. I know that there are women who have double mastectomies who don't have reconstruction for a variety of reasons. And I'm not going to get into all those reasons here, but I have to say, I specifically remember one such woman who had breast cancer and had it removed and did not want reconstruction. And because of this idea, this pervasive idea that to be a woman, you must have breasts, through her entire fight and battle with cancer, she was constantly questioned over and over and over again about when she was going to get her reconstruction of her chest, even though she did not want it. She made that very clear. "Now, you're going to regret it," they would tell her. "Are you sure?" On and on and on. This is where, as I mentioned before, this kind of thinking can be problematic and affect other people. So let me move on and talk about my definition of being a woman. For me, and not just I say for me as if this is anecdotal, when we talk about the term woman, the term itself is a gendered term, which again is different than sex. So woman is a gender identity. It is not a biological sex. And this gets, again, confusing, not only because the way we were raised, but I decided to look up in some dictionaries, how do they define woman? And there are comments like, it's an adult female person. Female is a sex characteristic term. Woman is a gender identity. And here again, they're conflating the two. So it makes sense that it's confusing. And then you look in the medical dictionaries, and depends on the dictionary you look at. They may still bring in some similar definitions with sex, and they have added on the idea that it is based on how you identify, how a person self-identifies. I will say there are some medical dictionaries that get it clearly right and do not, like the Stanford Dictionary does not put biological sex and conflate the two. But to me, this is part of the evolution of understanding. It takes a little bit of time, and we're starting to see it correctly written in medical dictionaries. But again, it's taking time. And so it makes sense why there'd be some confusion. But when we understand that gender and sex are different, and that to be a woman is a gendered term, then we begin to understand that something that we define ourselves. And when we conflate sex and gender and rely on narrow definitions as discussed today, it's harmful to everyone. For some, in the ways I've already mentioned, like women who don't have periods or babies, it's harmful. Women who are born intersex, who may have different anatomy and or chromosomes and typically associated with gender, it's harmful. And the concerns continue on. They continue to run deeper. It's inherent in all these discussions. What is inherent, I should say, in all these discussions are that others are defining what it means to be a woman to women, for women. And yet when I ask people, like I mentioned, I have a lot of these discussions. When I ask people what it means to be a woman, I get about as many definitions and explanations as there are stars in the sky. When many people answer the question, they answer me in a way that it sounds like it's as clear as day and everybody would agree. Yet, I find most answers differ in some slight nuanced way, some dramatically different, some slightly different. Whether some focus on gender expression or biological characteristics or certain personalities or personality traits, anything along those lines, it varies. But here's the problem. These rigid definitions that many people hold have a harmful impact, which extends beyond transgender people. This is especially evident when it comes to appearance and abilities. And this has never been more obvious than in the Olympics. If you go to social media, I've already mentioned the boxer Khelif, and there's another boxer. There's another boxer, Lin Yu Tin, who has also been affected by these discussions, but it goes beyond that. If you go onto social media, and I encourage you to do this, check out Ilana Meher, an American rugby player on the women's team, talk about how she too has been often called a man because of her physical appearance and her physique. And I love the way she talks about it. So really, it's worth a listen. But we can look back and see this in many of the top women's athletes who are particularly successful, that all of a sudden their womanhood gets called into question. And you don't have to look far to see this. Serena Williams is another great example, and the list can go on and on for those of them that kind of reach the top of their field. But this also goes not just with physical traits, it goes with personality traits. I mean, I remember when I learned about gender expression, which gender expression is how you express your gender, and it is defined by society and its hair and its makeup, but it's also personality traits, behavioral traits. And when I learned that some of my personality traits were considered masculine per society, like my directness or my analytical brain, I was very upset, not gonna lie. I view myself as a woman and I see myself as feminine, and I don't like really being considered not feminine. And I don't consider those aspects of myself less feminine. And in fact, I consider society to be a bit backwards for it. And I quite honestly rejected the label. And this is what I mean by it hurts everyone. These stereotypes limit who a woman can be in terms of appearance and personality, which is counter to feminist principles. So, to conclude, the most inclusive and accurate definitions of being a woman is based on the inner sense of self. It is defined by the individual and how they see themselves. There isn't one definition that fits all. And I hope you take the time in whatever your answer was at the beginning of this podcast of what does it mean to be a woman, to sit back and consider some of the stuff we have discussed today, and to consider, do you think it qualifies? Whatever your definition was or is, do you think everybody that identifies as a woman will fit under your definition? Now, if you're thinking that we must have a definition for the sake of sports, since it's all started with the Olympics after all, I will address that next week, talking about sports and gender. So make sure to subscribe if you want to be notified when the episode is released, so you may continue to learn and be part of the conversation. For now, I look forward to the day when none of us has to worry about being man enough or woman enough. I want us all to be accepted for who we are, as we are, and know that we are all human enough. Have a great week. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Engender Love. If you have more questions, visit my website at engenderlove.com. You can contact me, sign up for my newsletter, or schedule a time to meet and see how I can support you. Have a great week and continue to engender love.